In this video, we are going to Redbeard's Treasure Chest, which is an awesome place in my area to find video games out in the wild, whether it's retro, modern. There's a ton of awesome stuff here, whether it's consoles, games, even some manga, which is pretty interesting. But come along with me and watch to the end to see some of the wild stuff that I ended up picking up. But enough about that. Let's head into the actual treasure chest itself and see what we could find. First thing I ended up finding was fake Pokemon games, and anytime I find fake games, I just don't buy anything from the vendor, so I automatically moved right along to where I found a few games here on the shelf for the Xbox One, but they were mainly sports games, so I continued on where I rounded the corner here, and that's when I found this Nintendo DS carrying case. This is like an over-the-shoulder kind of crossbody bag. For $6, this is definitely well worth picking up. And honestly, anytime I can find kind of bags, carrying cases, anything that's under like $10, I'm probably definitely going to pick it up. But this thing is absolutely awesome. It is perfect for unzipping and putting your consoles in it. And it even actually ended up having these two little cartridges for DS games, which I thought was pretty interesting. But overall, for $6, when I saw this, I knew I had to have it. But there's a ton of more stuff I'm gonna pick up here, so let's continue on and see what else I can find. So, of course, I ended up carrying on where I made my way to this booth that had a ton of little figures on this table. I found this Princess Peach figure, and while I was looking around, back behind, they actually had a few games here, but honestly, these have been here a while and have definitely been picked through, so there wasn't anything that I grabbed there, so I left that booth and continued on to this booth, where they've had a few games here for a while, and I did find this Midway Classics Origins game, which I'm interested in, but they wanted a little too much for it, so unfortunately, I'll have to leave this behind until maybe next time I go and the price is different, but nothing there was worth picking up, so I continued on to this booth where I actually ended up finding a few games here. First off was a 3DS game out in the wild, which is pretty interesting, and then a few PSP games that I ultimately ended up grabbing for $5 a piece, which is totally awesome. Then in the booth still, they had a ton of different plushes there. Most of them are Pokemon. There's a few other like video game related ones here and there, like the llama or Mario or a bunch of Koopas, Spyro. They just had a ton of stuff, but ultimately all I ended up picking up were these three PSP games for $5 each. This was definitely well worth picking up considering they're all complete. Starting off with Ape Escape on the Loose. I actually don't have this game, so when I saw this and then I noticed it was $5, I knew I was picking that up. And kind of the same thing with SpongeBob the Yellow Avenger. This game looks like it's going to be dorky, fun, but I'll absolutely love it. So $5 for that. Definitely not bad at all. And last but not least, Star Wars Battlefront 2. Back when this came out on the PSP, it absolutely blew my mind that you could play Star Wars Battlefront on the go. It was absolutely crazy, so when I saw this for $5, I had to grab that as well. These three games at one booth for $15 in total are definitely well worth it, but there's a lot more that I ended up finding, so let's continue on. Then I ended up seeing this booth where they had a bunch of homemade creatures. That Kirby was a little creepy, but this Diglett and those Koroks were pretty cool. But I didn't want to buy them, so I made my way to this booth, which is basically just a video game booth. They had a ton of consoles and games here. Most of the consoles here were overpriced, but some of the games, if you pick through, were definitely well worth it. Like, again, these console prices are just insane that someone would actually ask that much. Yeah, no thank you there, but while I was here, I did look through their games while I was, obviously I'm going to do that, you know that. I checked out the NES games here, I checked out the PSP, as well as the Super Nintendo games. Didn't really find anything. Down below that was a bunch of GameCube games, and I've actually bought from this booth before from their GameCube section, and honestly, this time they didn't have any games that were worth picking up, so unfortunately, I didn't end up grabbing any GameCube games, which was kind of a bummer, but it is what it is there. I then continued to the Xbox One, the Xbox 360, and the Xbox Original here, and didn't really find anything, so I made my way to the PlayStation side of this rack, where I checked out the PS2 games down at the bottom, the PS3 games, and then above that was some PS4 games and some Wii games. I did my due diligence here. I looked through trying to find games that I didn't have, but unfortunately I didn't really have anything here or there. And then I made my way to some Wii U and PS5 and a Switch game, which was pretty interesting to see. But then I made my way to the DS section, where I actually ended up finding a DS game that I ended up picking up, and that was Death Jr. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but I kind of rose through here and didn't find anything else. But I did end up getting Death Jr., which looks absolutely awesome and interesting. This game looks weird and wacky, right up my alley. And then I made my way to the PS1 section, where I actually ended up finding a few games that were well worth it. I ended up grabbing Warhammer Shadow of the Horned Rat, and then I looked a little bit more here and there, and that is when I ended up also finding Darkstone, which looked interesting to me. And last but not least, in the PlayStation section, I ended up finding Legend of Dragoon here towards the right. All three of these games were well priced, so of course I ended up grabbing those, and I ended up finding a good deal. Starting off, that Legend of Dragoon, absolutely awesome. I wish it was a normal one and not a greatest hits, but it is what it is. Darkstone looks interesting to me, as well as that Warhammer game, so I'm definitely glad that I ended up grabbing these while I was in this booth. But I ended up continuing on to this next booth, where I actually found a few video games there as well. Some expensive games, but they were a little too overpriced, so unfortunately I would have loved to have that in my collection, but I ended up leaving that behind, and I thought this was funny, but ultimately I didn't grab it. And I turned to the right before I was going to leave, and found the Zelda Ocarina of Time manga, as well as a Sega Genesis controller. So these two booths actually ended up having a bunch of different stuff that was well worth it. As you can see at that last booth, I ended up finding a Zelda Ocarina of Time manga, which I saw the price, and just had to grab that. And then I found a few games at that reseller booth, basically. This Death Jr. looked absolutely awesome, so when I saw this and the price, I was like, okay, I'm getting that, no problem. And then I made my way to the PlayStation 1 games, and I ended up finding Darkstone, which looks like an interesting RPG game. Kind of gives me like old RuneScape vibes. I don't know too much about it, but I definitely ended up grabbing that. Then I ended up seeing Warhammer Shadow of the Horned Rat. Anytime I see something that's Warhammer related and is a good price, I don't know too much about Warhammer, but I saw this and I figured I might as well grab it. It looks like it could be fun and kind of gives me like Age of Empire kind of vibes. I'm not quite sure about it, so I'll have to check that. And then last but not least, the Legend of Dragoon here. This is complete. Now, I wish it wasn't the greatest hits. It was just a black label, but that is what it is. I'm not going to be too upset there because this is complete and definitely well worth it. Then I was making my way towards the back, and I turned the corner and noticed this giant Pikachu Squishmallow. Now, I did realize there's a huge stain on it, but this was with tags for 20 bucks. If that stain wasn't as crazy, I might have picked it up. Then this next booth ended up having this bag that had like a bunch of little Mario figures in it, but I ultimately ended up passing on it, mainly because I saw what you see in the corner over here, and that is a Super Princess Peach Nintendo DS lunchbox. They only wanted $8 for this, which was absolutely insane. And this is probably the craziest thing I picked up today. When I saw this, I knew I had to have it. I actually have a Wii lunchbox that is very similar. This one is clean on the inside and is a little beat up on the outside, but nothing that keeps me from buying that. So I'm definitely stoked that I ended up finding that. Then in the booth, I kind of went around and ended up finding a few games on that shelf, and they had a little mug here, as well as a Nintendo Labo customization kit, which I think is pretty funny because I believe that's just stickers. And at the bottom on the ground, they ended up having this little plushie bin where I found Pikachu, Sonic, and Squirtle. So those were pretty cool to see, but ultimately, you guys know I am definitely super excited about this Nintendo DS Princess Peach lunchbox. This thing is absolutely awesome. Just take a look at this thing. Take a look at this thing. I only paid $8 for this, which is absolutely crazy. I'm sure this is probably only worth like 20 or 30 bucks. I haven't looked it up or anything, but when I saw this, I was like, okay, I need to have this because I have the Wii one somewhere back there. I don't actually remember where it is. Maybe it's down below, but this is so awesome. I love these lunch boxes from back in the day. So anytime I can find a Nintendo DS stuff as well, I'm gonna pick it up. And for $8, this is like a no-brainer. This is probably the coolest thing I ended up finding today. But there's still a little bit left to find, so let's continue on. And that brings me to the last few booths here. I ended up spotting a few games here on this wall, which I think is kind of interesting that a booth is on the wall like this, but I kind of dug through it a little bit trying to see if there was anything worth picking up, but unfortunately there wasn't. So I left that booth and kind of wandered around the corner where I ended up spotting a ton of green cases, and right off the bat was FIFA Street for the Xbox 360. Then I kind of dug through to see if there was anything else worth picking up. I made my way through all the Xbox 360 games, and then down below was actually a few more games that I ended up checking out. They all ended up only being Xbox One games though, so I kind of put everything back, looked through the Xbox One games a little bit, but there's only a few, and ultimately ended up grabbing the FIFA Street because I love these old street football or any kind of sports game, so I grabbed that for the Xbox 360. I found a few games here, but nothing I needed, as well as some Pokemon cards at this next booth. Then in this glass case, I did end up finding Paper Mario Origami King, but I didn't end up grabbing it because it was a little overpriced. And as I made my way back to the front to check out, I found this booth had a bunch of loose discs here. I kind of looked through them, mostly like $5 to $10 Wii U games. If I didn't have them, I might have picked them up, but I had all of these games that were in this booth. But then back behind it, I kind of wandered a little bit more and found a few more games here that were pretty interesting. Nothing I had to have, but anytime I can find some Xbox 360 games, I'm at least gonna stop to look. And that is when I obviously found FIFA Street for the Xbox 360. For $8, I believe this game is worth like 12 to 15 complete for the 360, but any of these street games are absolutely awesome. It's got Messi on the front, so I figured I'd grab this and probably play it and see if it's fun or not, because I've never really heard anything or too much about this, so I think this was well worth picking up. But I ended up finding a ton of awesome stuff. I found a bunch of games, even a manga, and then 2 carrying cases. Obviously, one's for the DS, and then one's the lunchbox. Honestly, I was not expecting to find this much stuff while I was here, but occasionally I'll stumble in here and find some awesome stuff, and today was no different. I think my favorite thing has to be this lunch pail. You guys know, this thing just looks amazing, and I can't wait to display it on my shelves, as well as those $5 PSP games, which I hardly ever find complete in-box PSP games, especially not for $5. And then a few games at that reseller booth were pretty awesome. But enough about that. I've got some games to test. some lunch pails to clean. So I'm getting out of here, so check that video out if you haven't already. But I want to know what you thought was the best or coolest thing that I ended up finding. For me, you guys already know it's this thing, but I want to know what you think. Comment down below and let me know. But enough about that. I gotta get out of here, so check that video out if you haven't already.